million at this point. Ed really had a great deal to do with the launching of the field of social entrepreneurship and venture philanthropy and things of that nature. He started very early an organization that helped nonprofits figure out how to develop revenue streams of one sort or another. It's very much like Community Wealth Ventures has been doing now. But he started it and did a lot of writing about the field and became an important force in the field. And then we took over the Surdna Foundation, or it took him over. I don't know. I never quite figured out exactly what it was. In any event, he managed to implement a lot of the kinds of things that he had preached in his work in social entrepreneurship. When I got to New York, everybody talked about the Surdna Foundation as a foundation that had extremely good judgment in picking its grantees, so that a lot of us, including me at Atlantic, when the grantee came to us seeking funds and had already gotten support from the Surdna Foundation, that was like a blue ribbon seal of approval. And so it always facilitated. I mean, great to have somebody come when you know that the judgment is really good. And it's so easy at that point to get much further, much more quickly than it is if you have to go through a whole due diligence process. In any event, that's true. I've told him this before, so it's no surprise to him. But it is, in fact, the case that is his reputation in New York. In the fields in which he's working, there really isn't a better judgment seal than the one that Surdna had. And he built a terrific staff there, people who have just done wonderful jobs in what they're doing. So I want to thank Ed. He's also, I should tell you, he's on the board of the independent sector. He's a member of the panel on nonprofits, which has been spearheading the effort of the nonprofit sector to respond to the Senate Finance Committee's proposals for regulatory change with respect to nonprofit regulation. And he's been a really good citizen. I think you were on board with the council. You were on board with the council. No. You never. How did you manage to defend them? In any event, it's a great pleasure to have him here. Before I turn the floor over to him, I think we should go around the table and let the distinguished figures like Tom Landon and others around the table lead off and say who they are. So Ed, if he doesn't already know them, will in fact know them. So Tom, why don't you lead off?
Tom Landon, Senior Fellow at the Z. Smith Rungus Foundation.
Peter Bond and Burroughs.
Rand Coble with the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research.
Jane Kendall with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. I have one little comment to make for the students and others who are thinking about going into foundations. Take this book and use it as your manual in terms of a user-friendly foundation. This is one of the best annual reports that there is, and it reflects the philosophy of the foundation.
I'm Catherine Burnett, and I will be using this as the manual. I'm writing the annual right now for the Human Charity Trust.
Greg Dees, I teach the school business. And I've been a fan of Ed's, by the way, for over 20 years. So
I'm going to wreck my reputation in 1 hour. I can do it all. So.
Beth Anderson, I'm in people schools.
Tony Brown, Public Policy Faculty in the Enterprise and Leadership Initiative, and soon to be the Robertson Scholars Program.
I'm Crawford Goodwin in Economics.
And Crawford, I should tell you, was at the Ford Foundation for a number of years. I think before you were at the Surdna Foundation.
I am Kristen Goss. I'm on the faculty here, and I was the hub reporter who had the privilege of writing the story for the Chicago Philanthropy when Ed Skloot was appointed to the Surdna Foundation.
I'm Betsy Conti. I'm a friend of Charles and a few others here in this room, and I've worked on local, state, and national public policy, and recently moved into the private side, and I'm honored to be here and hear what you guys have to say.
I'm Mullen Glossman. I coordinate the Duke Foundation Research Program.
Go around the table here and we'll come back and go back around.
Barry Varela, I'm the case writer at the Duke Foundation Research Program.
Barbara Goodman, NJ Fletcher Foundation.
Ed Fisk, I'm a journalist about education.
Okay.
Charlie Popfelter in public policy and been a fan of Ed's for some time.
Charlie is the director of the Center for Philanthropy and Volunteerism, under which our program operates, and others as well.
I'm Todd Cullen with the Philanthropy Journal. It's an online publication based in Raleigh at the A.J. Fletcher Foundation.
I'm David Senator, at this morning I'm a student at the placements class.
I'm Jonathan. I'm a PC fellow from South Korea.
And Stephen Schindler, a student, Professor Fleischman's, and I'm glad to be here as well.
Good. So thank you all very much for coming. And Ed, you're on.
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you for showing up. I mean, it's a gorgeous day, and I wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for you. So I'm here. And I'm honored to be here. I'm particularly honored to be here with Joel hosting me. We have a mutual admiration society, and I think it flourishes. And Joel, as some of us had dinner at this place last night, and I'm sure all of you had, with this Abrahamic view that you take care of the traveler. Feed them and give them the right kind of treatment. And I think it was a lovely night last night. What I want to ask of you is, well, let me tell you something first. I'm not known as a tribute violet. And for me, this is the hardest conversation I think I've ever entered into. The reason is that I've been at Surdna, as I think you know, for about 18 years, and I'm going to be leaving Surdna at my choice in June. And I've never had the opportunity, or I've never given myself the opportunity to reflect on or think about what has happened in place. And I started to do this. Yes, I want to say that. So I'll say it now. So I'm hoping that we will, whatever I may say, I really would like to keep within these four walls. I'm not even sure what I'm going to say, but there'll be enough here, I'm sure, that I wish that we would keep it amongst ourselves as colleagues and friends. So anyway, I haven't had a chance to reflect on this. As some of you know, I was supposed to come down 6 weeks ago or something like that, and the plane never got off the runway, so I never did. And so this has now been sitting on the side waiting for some kind of airing. And I find it very emotional for me to think about this and to try to put some perspective on a story which has been half my working life. And because of that, I'm not exactly sure the trajectory of this thing is going to go on. But bear with me, and I hope that we can, tease out from what I think is going to be a story. It's the story of the Surdna Foundation as in its modern incarnation. And I'll be very candid with you in every way I know how. And then I'd certainly love to get your sense of things and feedback, questions, and conversation. So let me begin. My time at Surdna is framed by a quotation that was written in a book by Wally Nielsen. Some of you may know his name. Wally was a commentator on philanthropy and a writer on philanthropy who wrote 3 or 4 books. They sort of decent journalism, I call it. And one of those books he wrote was called The Golden Donors, in which he profiled virtually all of the landscape of philanthropy. And in that book, which was published in 1986, this is what he had. He had about a page and a half about Surdna. And it was before I got there. And this is what he wrote. I'm taking the key piece. Given the extraordinary generosity, vision, and boldness of the donor, and the scale of its assets, it remains an underachiever. It awaits the force of a strong, imaginative leadership to lift it from being a moderately good foundation to the status of an excellent one. If this happens someday, it will finally correct the impression that not the only thing backward about Surdna is the spelling of its last name. Surdna is the name Andros spelled backwards. It's a family, no Andros you've never heard of, but it was a man who made a pot of money at the time with Rockefeller and Carnegie and so forth. And so while he wrote this book, while he was a curmudgeon, he was very smart. And this is the frame in which the board was living. It was set up in 1917. It was run and dominated entirely by family members. So one day, and I won't go through this story because it's not really important, I wanted to work here. I was running this nonprofit operation, and I said, gee, I got to get to the other side of the street. And I just got to do it. So one way or another, I get this job. And this quotation was on everybody's mind. So when I got there in 1989, there was a high level of expectation and a high level of embarrassment. Surdna was not well known, deliberately so, and it was run by two family retainers who were essentially squandering the money. To give you, Joe, how long should I talk?
As long as you like. Within reason.
Within reason. I'll be reasonable. Surdna, again, I need to frame this picture for you. There really were three institutions, not one. We also run a skilled nursing home in Hastings on Hudson, 230-bed SNF, and we also run a school and residence and now treatment center for emotionally disabled children. That's in Yonkers on the farmstead that the Anders family had, its property. And both of those continue today, and there were like 3 planets in orbit, and there's a 4th planet, which I may have a chance to mention to you, which has been discovered or recreated. So what I came to in 1989 was a foundation that was entirely family run, but the family didn't know anything about it. It was run by 2 very secretive fellows, both of whom quit when I was appointed. Didn't want anything to do with anybody, particularly me.
These were members of the board?
They were members of the board.
And members of the family?
They were in-laws of the family.
Oh.
They were husbands of wives who were family members. There were 12 or 13 members of the board at the time. The board chair is still alive. He's 97. John E. the first died at 96. And he is a phenomenal guy. And he was the one who essentially moved to change the foundation. Foundations don't change very quickly, and this is a key point, obviously. He had been chair of Surdna for over 20 years, and he was in his 70s. By the time he could get up enough oomph and agreement to make the move to professionalize a family institution. And they did search and so on and so forth, and my name came up to the top, and I took this job. So you have these retainers who run a very secretive operation. It is a big black box to relatives. There is no openness about it. It publishes no annual report. And there are no outsiders. And there are no guidelines. There are general ideas, but, and this is absolutely true. I mean, a dermatologist from Harvard would come through, make an appointment, and talk about some big project he or she was doing, and they make a grant. And that sounded pretty good. So you can see it was entirely reactive, and it was entirely, a very strange place. Couldn't get him on the phone because the only person on the phone was a woman who worked half-time. She left at 4 every day to pick up her kid from school. And Surdna, therefore, people would be rapping figuratively on the door of this place and could get no response from anybody. They also took no outside funding for the 2 homes, which as of right they were permitted to get: state education department money, Medicare, Medicaid. It was the old view of check, where when a person came into this, what we call, everybody calls the old folks home, they didn't have to pay a nickel for the rest of their lives. And they got Waldorf service. There were 10 chefs in this building. And one of the first things I had to do was tell them, 2/3 of the endowment payout every year would go to take care of the homes. I said, do you want a foundation? Ultimately, it took 3 or 4 years, but they began to take state and federal money. So here I am. I show up. Now, I'm a kid from Brooklyn. Choosing me from the other side of the tracks, literally from the nonprofit sector, was just a total surprise to me as well as everybody else. this thing, and I really don't know what to do. But I'm matched by the fact that they don't know what to do either. I mean, it's like the virus came into the system. Well, so I get hired. In fact, in this report, this is the most recent one, isn't it? There's my sort of farewell letter, and in it, it tells the story of what happened to me on the day I got hired by John Andrews. It's a really cute story that at one point in time freaked me out. So my conclusion that I want to just at this point say is I come into an institution that is dark, secret, and is a total startup. Because what they wanted to do was to professionalize, very positive impulse all the way, but they didn't know how, and I certainly didn't know how either. They'd never employed anybody. When it came time to talk about fringe benefits, that they would pay me in the job, there was no one on the board who knew anything about what fringe benefits were. None of them worked. And I didn't know what to ask for, because I didn't want to be greedy or be perceived. So the headhunter at the time volunteered. And he said, Sam, you know, John, let me figure something out and I'll get back to you. And that's how the fringe benefits at Surdna Foundation got established. It was that level of professionalization. Okay, so what did I do? I stopped all grant making for a year. I said, enough, put everybody on hold, anything we're obligated to do, let's do, and let's try to figure out together what we want to start to make grants in. Here's an example, by the way, in philanthropy of where we were at all. When I got to Surdna, the endowment level value was $292 million. And Surdna was about 50th in size in philanthropy in the country. In 2007, the Surdna asset base is close to $900 million. We've given away over $400 million. And yet we're 75th or 80th in size in the country. So the cascading amounts, large amounts of money coming into the field now should be perfectly apparent to everyone. We are, as big as we are, smaller than we have ever been relative to other countries. I went around to visit the board, and I went to each individually. At the time, there were about 250 relatives, first cousins and so forth. Now there are about 350 in fourth and fifth generations. And I guess there are a few sixth now, too. And I tried to figure out, what is it you want to do? I mean, and what I discovered was that they didn't talk to each other. So they didn't know what they wanted either. I mean, the instincts were okay, but the clarity certainly was not. One of the things that did come clear, I was fortunate to suss out, was the area of the environment. But environment went from animal husbandry to humane societies to land preservation. So had to figure something out that could please enough people enough at the time. The second area, we chose two areas to do with. Essentially, I assembled a whole lot of information, data, and put it together. We had retreats, we brought in experts, things that most people would normally do. There was a profound interest on many of the board members' parts about doing something with regard to family. Family is a very big concept at the Surdna Foundation and at many family foundations. Well, what are you going to do about family? So they wanted fund in family issues. And as I probed deeper and deeper, I began to see that this was not where I thought that philanthropy was about or should be going. They were very attached to junior league kinds of programs and activities, some of which are really very good and some are not so good. And they couldn't get clear about what it was that they thought was really good to fund beyond that. In a stroke of boldness, I'm not sure genius, I asked Marian Wright Edelman, who you know, to come in from Children's Defense Fund and speak with her. And she scared the shoes off. She was talking about crack babies, and she was talking about 14-year-old pregnant girls, and you could see the reverberations. That's not what we want, that's not what we want. And I came back and I said, let's get serious and do it something like this. So what I was able to do was to flip the idea into the concept, which Marian later picked up and others, that you can't have a solid family structure without having a solid community, or it takes a village, and Hillary says. And I tried to work it so that we could do community development, community revitalization, and make sure the housing supports were available and so on and so forth, as well as some social services, so that we could get enough people to buy into the concept. It's always been threatened with being changed and upended, but I think we're pretty okay now. So those are how these two program areas got chosen. The board gave me approval to hire people. The approval was, there are two things I demanded when I took the job, and I didn't feel like I had much right to ask for anything else. One was the ability to hire, and they would not hire, and they broke that rule once with me, and it's never worked its way through the system well. But other than that, it's been fine. I just thought that was the executive privilege. And the second was no cats and dogs, meaning somebody walks in, my brother's cousin is around, and working, and I really said, we can't run a foundation on the basis of cats and dogs. So it's got to stop. And for the most part, it did. Everybody respected their own rules, the rule. Am I going okay? Is this too flaky for
Great.
you?
No.
I just sort of want to tell you a story. I want to make it, and then we can explode it out into what does this mean for philanthropy, or maybe not. But the story is interesting. So I did this for several years. The culture was uncertain, great deal of suspicion. As with many wealthy people, and not all the members of the board were wealthy, so most were well off, but a few were very wealthy. They were very suspicious of anyone and didn't want their pockets picked. And that was as clear with staff as it was with outsiders. So when I would come to them with ideas for spending something on something, in some cases they would say, no, you can't do that, and they took it very personally. On the other hand, the biggest grant that we made for many, many years was the grant we made in the first year of grant making, after settling on these two ideas. And interesting story, the meeting was on Monday at the board. We used to have 3-day meetings, folks. 3 days, 4 times a year. And it was half a day in homes, we called them, and then 2 days each in the homes. The day before, 2 days before the meeting, I was ice skating with our son and my wife. My skate point got caught. I gave myself a triple spiral fracture up my leg. I got to the emergency room, I set my cast up to here, and I have to go to my first major meeting of the Surdna board. So I'm sitting in a wheelchair, and I roll myself with my leg up, and I made a little Surdna flag, and I put a flag on top of my toe, and I was just trying to make it look as good. I don't know whether that had any impact on the grant, but on the docket was a proposal for a $3 million grant to do a major piece of work in rebuilding the South Bronx. And like that, it went through. So you could never know exactly what the move was at the time and place in order to work what had to be done. On the other hand, they gave us very little money to experiment. So, and along with this fear of having their pockets picked, the board made a rule, which we've now mutually agreed to break periodically. After every 3 years, grantees have to take a year's break. They didn't want anyone to become dependent on them. And what that essentially meant was they didn't want to depend on them. They didn't want to get too close to somebody who would then get too close to them. But the concept of being dependent when we would be making a $75,000 grant to teach for America or something is preposterous. But it was the mindset of this family and of many families, of many wealthy families. Something has to interpose itself between that family and the world. And it would, in this case, be the staff. There was a mix of pride and fear. Didn't really know exactly what to do, but we took the shot. We all took the shot. And there was a general lack of understanding of what philanthropy was, fundamentally. About half the board was there but didn't really know why. As I said, there were no outsiders, and have been no outsiders until 2.5 years ago, when we got our first 2 outside members. That sidebar is pure dysfunction. If you're anywhere on boards like that, don't let it happen. Abby O'Neill of the Rockefeller family said publicly maybe 15 years ago at a big function of the Council of Foundations, she was asked, why did you have outsiders come in to run your foundation with the family? Her answer was something like, because I knew, or we knew, that the only way to make the foundation behave was to bring in the guests for dinner. And the guests were the staff. And that's how she meant it, and that's how people took it. I mean that as a compliment. They knew from the beginning of it. It was Gates, I forgot his first name, Frederick? Frederick T. Gates, who ran Rockefeller, and so forth. So at times there was trust, at times there was tremendous agita. There was a lot of freelancing by some of the members dealing, on that, able to make grants when they really weren't. We tried to go on a straight line. We did pretty well, I think, as you look at it. There was always tension between staff and board. And there remains, well, it's much less so today. Things have changed. We carved out our areas of work, and then we added 3 as the corpus grew. We added first a program in effective citizenry, creating an effective citizenry. We focused on young people, and young people creating and arguing for their own causes at school boards and so on and so forth. Very effective, very effective. An arts program, and then a small program which we were essentially the caboose on, Joel's train, having to do with the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. And Surdna and Atlantic at the time, and 2 or 3 others, were the only funders of the field itself that really actually had a program. And we cared about the institutions of the field, about making the field, better, stronger, fatter, wider, all those things. But the field in general, philanthropy, does not take care of its own. It chooses to go elsewhere, not here. I'll give you a few examples of what, let me say this. My perspective was a few things. First, I'm jumbling around now. It was essential to remove the gray cloud over the Surdna Foundation, in my view. And the way to do that was to be very aggressive, and one of the ways to do that was to do what I call early upgrade. We became a foundation that was known for taking small to middle-sized bets on new ideas. And if they were to come to fruition, we would then do another thing, and I'll come back to this if there's time. Let me frame it differently. In my view, money in philanthropy is less than half the job. It's less than half of what you've got, and it's less than half of what you do. You cannot get into the game without it. But once you've got it, it doesn't mean very much unless you know what to do with it. And in hiring my staff and dealing with them, I have constantly reiterated the issue of what we call beyond the money. It's not just convening and bringing people around the table to listen to an interesting idea or a good speaker. We make house calls. If we think, we've done it with Joel, Joel did it with us. I mean, if we thought something we really had the staying power and the importance that meant to us, I or one of my program staff would go out directly to our colleagues and sit down and talk with them about it. As long as you know where you love them, you can do that. We were always looking to leverage our reasonably small amount of money, always. And we became expert at doing that. And I can give you examples of that as we go on. But it is the beyond the money, it's relationships. Much of philanthropy is transactional. You send me a proposal, I read it, I do due diligence, I get back to you with questions, dump, I make a grant or I don't make a grant. And it might take me a year until you learn, which is another problem of philanthropy. And I think it's because most of the people I hired, including myself, came from the other side of the table. And we were determined not to treat people badly. I think we've got a good reputation in doing that. And we always tried to. So that beyond the money involves relationship building, not transaction doing. And the best foundations, in my experience, on both sides of the coin, have been those foundations that can do it. It's far more labor intensive, but in a real way, in my experience, it's also a far greater amount of fun. It's great to break bread with people. It's great to really figure out what's going on and have them be candid with you so that you know that there's a problem in that place and you don't have to find out after the executive director fled to Montenegro and you can't find him anymore. Occasionally that stuff happens. So we were user-friendly. We took the initiative. We were proactive. We did a number of things that I was hoping would push Surdna out so that the story about Surdna Andrews spelled backwards would not be the first thing that we all heard every time we met people in the party. And in fact, over the time and over the years, a lot of that has happened. A number of funders have said, and I say this with pride, that Surdna is known for playing above its head. We are always the smallest player around the big table. But we have a seat at the table. And that's all I have ever been able to ask for anybody to do that. And if the ideas are good, great. If not, that's okay too. So we did a big piece of work in the South Bronx. We leveraged and brought in 4 or 5 banks, 8 or 9 foundations, raised roughly $30 million for a 7-year program in the early 90s, early 90s. It was very successful in the field of community development. And we began to get a reputation. Another thing that was important, I'm sorry, I'm not being linear, but I apologize. I just can't right now do that. It was very important for us to be able to sit at the table with our colleagues and be seen as people having expertise. You all know that in any field, there are dabblers and there are real doers and knowers. And my gamble was that if we could hire good people who were at the core of the knowledge of the field, we would have one leg up in terms of doing good grant making. I was very lucky to hire good people, self-starters, and so that worked. So with this collaboration with a dozen funders and banks, we began to get some real traction. And that continued on to a number of other places with a number of other kinds of initiatives. We take some flyers. For example, we were in the World Environment. No one in the, let's see, it would be 93, 94, something like that, was imagining that the environment and the religious community had any reason to get together. There's a fellow who some of you may know, Paul Gorman, who runs the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, NRPE. Terrific guy, started this operation to do just that. And we took a shot at Paul, to give an example of something that wasn't really being done, but to all of us felt like it was the right thing at the right time. And it's matured to a world now where the evangelical community, so he works with the Reformed Jewish community, Catholics, evangelicals, and I can't remember the fourth, mainline Protestant churches, who have built a remarkable combine activity of religionists who believe very strongly in environmental issues. And now they've become a major force fighting global warming and so on and so forth. So we would go out there and try to take the first shot at some stuff that we felt was really quite important. We did a little bit of lobbying, educating and political work, but we've always stayed away from it. The board just is not comfortable, doesn't want us to be down in Washington, and although our work in the environment has taken us down there in many different ways, we've always gone with partners so that we didn't look like we were running the train. So in the 90s, we built out 5 program areas. And as I said, the endowment was growing nicely. Surdna today has a staff of 19 people, and we're in different offices, and et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that we try to do very much is cross-program work. Again, I think we're fairly unusual in that. Everything I could do to keep silos from forming, I did. I tend to be a generalist, and I tend to be very restless. and I didn't want to have everybody in this kind of way. There are numbers of foundations that spend vast amounts of time where the people keep each other away from what they're doing, and we try to take the reverse position. And so our environment program and our community development program increasingly collaborated, and last year we began now to almost bring the two completely together. We do a lot of work on smart growth, a lot of work on climate change, particularly around auto use and whatever that mass transit and so forth. Places where communities that need mass transit desperately, usually communities of poor. At the same time, our environmental program has this on its mind with transit-oriented development, which you probably know about, and the issues of fighting sprawl and so on and so forth. So we were able to gradually bring these two together. And this year, we concluded that both programs are going to focus on 10 cities, 5 what are called weak market cities: New Orleans, Baltimore, probably Buffalo, not yet firm and fixed, Detroit, and I'll remember the 5th in a minute, which need a whole different set of strategies to redevelop themselves than Boston, New York, San Francisco, which equally have issues relative to the poor and to disadvantage, but the strategies needed to preserve these places for both sides are remarkably different. Which takes me to another point. I'm probably going to talk about 10 more minutes, I think. Is that okay? Sure. How's that? Which leads me to the point of, in this world of community development, we were very early up in working with CDCs, community development corporations. We thought that they would be the leaders and could become the real horsemen in this race. And it turns out that CDCs have not developed successfully well enough. There are probably 50 of them in the country that are worth something in terms of equity and so forth. Another 50 are middling, and the next 500, or whatever they may be, are 1 or 2 person operations. They do 16 units a year, and they're not consequential players. Gradually, we have moved and helped the field move from looking at these institutions as the brokers and doers to this market-based set of principles where our view is work with anybody, including private developers, so long as the product comes out the way that you want. So we are additionally, therefore, quite pragmatic in who we will choose to work with. And if it's a for-profit developer who's doing great work, and there are some fabulous ones out there who care about low-income housing, etc., they're right on our ticket all the time. So our programs, like all foundation programs, have gone through an organic development, and they've changed and all to the good. I talked about Beyond the Money. Years ago, for a long time, I used to say that Surdna was the lounge act for Atlantic and Ford and the rest. And you see us in the outside part of the casino, and then you go into Tony Bennett. We were out there, we were something else. But we're pretty close to inside the main room now, which makes me feel terrific. Now, let me talk a little bit, one more thing, and then I want to talk a bit about governance and a bit about board and staff relationships. Before I do, in the middle 90s, I then personally took another step. I decided it was time to have someone speak for Surdna in the public interest, and in our interest. One of the ways to do it is get yourself out there and start talking with people publicly. And you can be a thorn in the side, you can be very funny, whatever else. But if people don't know your work, then they're not going to pay attention to you. And you'll still be, oh, you're Andrew spelled backwards. And so I began to go on do about 3 or 4 talks a year into groups that I thought would be worth talking with, about philanthropy, about civic engagement, about stuff that was it was for us. My principle always was, we're not talking about me, we're talking about what Surdna's doing and how we try to do what we do. And we have had really quite remarkable results with that. I am by no means the smartest guy in town, but because there is not a history in the philanthropy world of people publicly tackling important issues, either to themselves or to the wider world, someone who's willing to get up coherently and talk for 20 minutes about it is going to find an audience. It just happens to be that way. But even more importantly, I encourage, as a matter of policy, my staff to do the same thing, to go to panels and be on them. And then something more controversial, I encouraged and still do them to serve on boards, even on boards of our own grantees. I think it's entirely defensible, and I've got a piece on it on our website if you folks want to look up more about it and what the argumentation would be. And so I believe that this profile that we were gathering because of our work deserved to be illuminated in the public arena. There are other funders that I'm certain are as good as we are, but now we'll be first on the Rolodex and not third. And I know this sounds very competitive. I know this sounds very aggressive. When you don't know how much longer you've got, my tenure was never certain. I never had a contract. All I had was a handshake. And at that point in time, and the only time I ever had one is now, when 4 years ago I said, I asked, let's pick a time, let's end it, it's great, let's do it right. And so we negotiated a 4-year contract, and I'm coming to the end of that now. And it feels very good. But I never knew, given the family structure and the tensions, that I would be longer around in 6 months. And so it's a tightrope walk, which is probably the message I'm trying to give. So let me talk now about governance. Most family foundations, and certainly the Surdna Foundation, have their biggest problem is in the area of governance. Because family and bloodlines and institutionalization on sort of a more corporate basis do not run in the same track. Never will. And the more you try to institutionalize a family, I'm looking at you because you know so much of this and you should be talking about it, but the more you try to institutionalize a family's behavior, the more headaches you're going to have, particularly when it's an upstairs-downstairs situation. And in our world, it has always been that. So you have to try to get what you want, but at the same time, you have to try to pay attention to things that you can't even see. You don't even know happened 45 years ago between two family members, and they linger. And you don't know why, but you have to be a professional staffer. And twice a year, I used to talk with my staff at lunch. Something would happen at a board meeting, and I couldn't get it, and I said, it doesn't make a difference. All we have to be is professional, and if we're yanked out of here, we know we behave properly. And my staff got it. I want to tell you also that for most of the members of our board, the relationships are excellent. The feeling of friendship, of breaking bread together, remains high. But in our case and situation, there were 2 and occasionally 3 people who were active saboteurs. They did not want this place to become an institution. They did not want rules to be made so that they couldn't break them. And they would constantly behave in ways that were debilitating to staff, and particularly to me. I'll give you one case in point, because it's, again, I'm just, I want you to see something. 7 or 8 years in, the chairmanship switched and a person became the chair. And the day he was elected chair, he called me up and he said, this is almost a quote, you are not the hub of the wheel. I am the hub of the wheel. And everything that happens now is going through me, etc., etc., etc. I was freaking out. I couldn't believe that this was happening after I thought we had gotten enough rules laid that everybody felt comfortable. Well, he always wanted the job that I had. That's the secret of the whole business. And he did not want to give that up. We had, those 5 years that he was board chair were the hardest years of my tenure. There were times when I went home ready to quit, or was expecting to get a call the following morning, but I was out. And I had 5 years of devastatingly hard work sometimes. But I guess I just didn't want to quit. I just didn't want to quit. So I kept going back and going back. And ultimately, the wheel changed. We got another board chair. You know, things became easier again.
Any recourse to you in terms of dealing with other board members about something like that? I remember you were talking with me about
Yes.
and I kept thinking, well, man, it's really gone at this point.
There's none. In our case, there's none.
Yeah.
Because I think that person is still on the board. He is as difficult to deal with his family members as he was with staff. But family will not let him off go from the board because he's a family member. And blood is thicker than water, and that's the way it goes. I want to fast forward till today. Let me just give you a picture of why things are really very different. And my successor, who was named about 6 weeks ago, is going to have a real cakewalk, I hope. We now have 2 outside board members, which the board did itself. They voted 9 years ago to bring on outside board members. And it took 7 years till they actually brought 2 of them on. But they brought them on. Hats off to them. We now have 3 new board members who are coming, who don't have a lot of this history. The tilt and the politics are already shifting. So at the board level, the dynamic is really very different. We also began to force institutionalization. There were no committees when I got there. Now there are actually working committees and so on. And by the way, the one working committee that was there wasn't there, but was set up immediately, was an investment committee. And you can see how successful that was. It was fabulous. So I don't want you to leave, or me to leave, leaving the impression that, no, this place is dysfunctional beyond belief. This place at times was dysfunctional beyond belief. And I was dysfunctional beyond belief. But it's worked out now where I think in 2007, the next trip around the circuit will be very good. There was always efforts of meddling and doing grant making, representing the foundation to their friends in their own hometowns. Just a few. I'm really talking about a minority of board members. But you know, any flying ointment can be quite difficult. And the problem that still remains, the one problem left, is that the board doesn't hold itself accountable for what it's doing. Also a problem in many family foundations, many foundations generally. And so even though there might be a dozen people on the board, 6 of them work at it. And the other 6 don't care. They don't show up. They don't participate. So the burden that's placed on the folks who do show up is immense. And they are not prepared, as you can see by all that I've said before, to confront their fellow family members and lay down the rules. You've got to serve on so many committees. You've got to do it. They do, but they don't follow through. I must tell you, I'm not part of this family. So for me, I can look in the window and say, oh, wow. But when you're part of this for now, it's a 90-year-old foundation, and there's a long history, 5 generations, so it's a different thing. Now, in the mid-90s, family decided to set up the AFF, the Andrews Family Fund, for 5th-generation kids to learn what philanthropy was all about. Wonderful idea. The Rockefellers have done this over time in a more or less formal way, and now with the Rockefeller Family Fund, they do it pretty substantially. We try to do similar things, and we have now the grant budget of AFF comes out of the Surdna pocket, and the grant budget is $3.5 million this year. It will be $4 million next year, and then capped. And so that in itself is its own program area. And family members are just thrilled and tickled pink about the ability to have kids in their 20s and 30s actually do this grant making. So there's a 4th now planet in orbit. We still have the old folks home. We still have the kids home.
They're taking federal money instead.
They are taking federal. They by agreement, which we worked out last year, get $800,000 a year from the Surdna corpus, or first from the Surdna payout. So these 3 institutions are, for the first time last year, taken care of, so it doesn't become what in earlier years had been an annual budget fight about, I want to put more money in kids' home, because the family members of Surdna are also the members of the other boards. So there are multiple conflicts going on at the same time. And some people handle them quite well, and some people don't handle them very well. So you can see this kind of stoop going around, and well, you know, most interesting. Let me kind of close it out. Where we are today, I think Surdna will go into an era of stability, of greater stability. It's clear to me that's what's going to happen. My successor is a young man of 38. The board wanted a younger person, particularly to deal with the next round of young people coming onto the board from family, and for a variety of other reasons. My senior person, the environmental director, is leaving, but he got a job to go to work with Prince Charles. And the Prince has a number of charities, one having to do with the built environment, which is very, very good. And Hooper is my colleague's name, decided to take it after being with us for 17 years, 16 years. So he deserves it. It's a wonderful job. But the place will be in great shape. And the staff is good. They've been there a long time. I hold very, very positive feelings towards what may happen over the next several years. We will continue to do beyond the money work. That's built into the DNA of the Surdna Foundation and the staff. And I will do it, I think, because it's just what they know how to do now. We also, 2 years ago, began a program, the biggest one in consequence of Surdna, a success measures program where we decided to hold ourselves accountable and figure out how successful we were. So up until, for the 2 years that ended February, this month, we put together a success measures program which has totally transformed in its first phase. The application process, everything is online, but beyond the communication side of things and the redoing of our guidelines, we have now determined to go from an aspirational foundation, what we want to do, we will fix bad cities and we will go to the moon or whatever it may be, into a place that jointly works with its grantees to create success measures of the programming that we fund, and will, on an annual basis, review that on the basis of submissions and conversations and so forth. It is a major cultural shift at the foundation among staff, which some staff have bought into well and some have not. All will over time, but it's a very, very different way of thinking, particularly when you say have a program in the arts, and people will say, but you can't decide whether someone's going to be a great painter or whatever it may be. How do we know? And the response back is, we've got to know something, or else we might as well just throw darts at the dartboard. And so I must tell you, the grantee community has been very forthcoming with us, because I think they saw the seriousness of the work, and we're at the end of phase 1 now, and my successor will pick it up from here and really begin the implementation process. So we've got the success measure work finished. We've reviewed our endowment, our program areas, we've sharpened them, we've made them better. I think the staff remains collegial and happy and enjoys their work. Finally, I guess I'd say I was determined to, when I left, as I told the board, when I leave here, the thing I want to leave is for the ability of all of the professional staff to get another job if for some reason they're not staying here because of your choice or their choice. So I believe that everyone now is employable by somebody else quite quickly. They're all talented, we just sharpened it up a little bit. And now I think everyone is in a very, very good place. I wrote up a list of 6, what I call determinants of foundation effectiveness. But let me stop, we can come back to that. So this is the story, an 18-year story. It's a cycle. It started, almost like, if you imagine Dodge City, when America wasn't even populated yet. It was That's sort of the way it was. Now we're probably close to, I don't know, maybe not Chicago, but Minneapolis. That's right, Minneapolis. Or Raleigh, Durham, or something like that. We're in civilization, and we're not going to be removed from it. And what's more, we have, like any transportation system, we've got our networks of rail and air and road, so we're connected with everybody. And I think we've got now an institution that is that can look back well on the hurdles it's had to jump and look forward to the hurdles that it's going to have to jump. And so the cycle begins again, which is the final point. It doesn't ever end, but sometimes there's, Pony Express stops, and we're at the Pony Express stop, and then we're going to deliver the mail again, but I don't know how we're going to do it. So that's the story of Surdna.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you very much. Now we'll throw the floor open for discussion. And I think, Kristen?
So during the 5 difficult years, in a practical sense, without forcing you to reveal anything comfortable revealing, how did that interfere with your ability to carry out your grant making, carry out your vision, and understand on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day basis, it was very difficult. I mean, I get a call, and I'm not as thick-skinned as I maybe should be. And just for a whole day, I'd be out of commission. I mean, I just couldn't write anything. I couldn't do anything. It hits you right in the face. Something comes up that is absurd or difficult or unreasonable. And you sit there and you sit at your desk and you puzzle out, how can I put this back on track? I mean, assuming I'm right for the moment. For the most part, I think I was right. There are times when I was not. So it was personally debilitating, and I saw my role as having to defend the staff, be in between the staff and the board, a few board members who would make it really difficult. So one way it was just personal. I would have a hard time doing the work that day, or for several days. On the other hand, I also got some good support from other board members. I don't want to get much deeper into it than that. It's an occupational hazard, and it came upon me quite suddenly, and it doesn't bend. I mean, let me give you an example of what happens. I mean, you'd be on a conference call with 3, 4, or 5 board members, and you'd come to a conclusion about something that had to be done one way or another. And this one particular board member would go right to his computer, and he would draft a memo and send it to everybody saying, this is the way it worked, these are the decisions we made, because I took notes, and here they are. And invariably, the email would be completely missing the mark. So what that caused, or causes, is a flurry of emails back. No, this isn't correct. No, we did this. No, we thought that. And then you get another flurry of emails correcting the other emails. And you wind up walking down this plank, disturbing the normal flow of work, because, in fact, board members are board members, and they need to be paid attention to. So in those intervening years, my relationships with a couple of them were in terrible, terrible shape. But, I can look back at it and say, I'm still here. And they can look back and say, they're still here too. And they are. They're still on board, and I'm not with them, so they survived.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question about the area of your grants making. That's your effective citizenry, and it really has 2 parts. I assume that there was some deliberation in the choice of that. You made a reference when you were discussing it to either civic engagement or civic education, but I assume there are reasons you chose not to describe it as civic engagement or civic education. And so the first part is, what was it that said to you that's what you want to call it? The second part is, in your grants making, your youth grants making, to what extent is it programs for youth, and to what extent is it programs by youth?
Okay. We did not choose civic engagement to say no, so much as we wanted to use the concept of creating an effective citizen. which is how we phrased it in our guidelines and still is in our handbook. The reason why was our theory of change, if you will, which only time will tell, was that if kids won't participate early on and the whole story and get involved and volunteer, whatever it might be, in schools and communities, they would not become good citizens. They wouldn't participate. So we thought that civic engagement was more narrow than we wanted to pitch it. Now, in fact, we began doing a lot of work on social and emotional learning, stuff that many funders do. We did a lot of work later on service learning, a number of other areas, many of which we got away from because in the literature as well as in our experience, they were not very good programs. Service learning, very active stuff in universities and colleges around the country, has been proved out to be a very, very modest gain at best for everybody involved. So I'm veered off, I'm sorry. But we wanted the larger frame for younger people to become effective citizens, as opposed to talk about the activity of civic engagement. It's a wordsmithing issue, but it had some meaning. The second question was programs for our kids. It is decidedly a program by kids. We do, the whole program is devoted to working with young people, organizing on behalf of themselves or their own communities. And it has a lot to do in two primary areas with improving schools for the kids, which they do themselves. They don't litigate, but changing the detention rules for the city of Los Angeles, where kids would be, yanked out. If you came in 3 minutes late, you'd be put in a pool and water room for an entire day and miss your class. That was school policy. That was district policy. And these kids got organized, and they made that change so that they could, say you're taking your kid to go to school, when you get there in time, you're 5 minutes late, you are being penalized in your educational process. It's an example of a grant that we spent 4 years on with this bunch of young kids, and the rules of the LA school district are now changed because of that. I can give you some other few examples. It is decidedly a program for kids doing the work themselves, with help, obviously. But, and I think it's been a most effective program. But even more importantly, behind your question is a very important philosophical concept. As most of you know, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, young people were seen as truants, and you got to be afraid of them, and there's no hope for the bad ones anyway, et cetera, et cetera. And we, with a number of other foundations, not very many, Hazen, a few others, began to develop the concept of youth as resources, as opposed to youth as problems. And over the course of a decade, youth funding has dramatically changed in its view of what young people can do. So we were able with others to have also an impact on how the field saw the issues. And I think that's a much more lasting and important thing that we were part of, and I'm really very proud of that.
Okay, Crawford? Are you able to move from your very interesting story to any generalizations about what you think should perhaps be the constraints on foundations? Is there an optimum size? Is it possible to be too large or too small? And I mean, should there be public policy that should constrain this?
No.
And should there be any restrictions on family dominance of foundations? I mean, you tell a pretty grisly story there. Should there be any kind of restraint that after a certain number of years, public members should be a majority?
Well, on your first question, issues of size, you can't do it. I mean, I can imagine the public policy process that people would try and go through and say, no bigger than this, no smaller than that. The fact is there are very big foundations that are mediocre, and there are very big foundations that are terrific. And the reverse with small ones. Some are great and some are terrible. So I think it's the variety of the ecology of philanthropy that we have to pay attention to. And it's very dangerous, I think, to try to make rules and regs that will force some kind of shift like that. That's my personal view. With regard, I think you were edging toward the question of spend down or something, or should there be some, or public representation. I would argue that public representation, with perhaps the exception of community foundations, which really have a different flavor and approach and cast, I'd be really, really resistant to that idea. Now, California had a bill about 4 or 5 years ago where they voted that any NGO that got money from the state they would have to be a public member on the board of directors. I think appointed by the AG, I'm not sure. I think the next year or two they got rid of it, but again, it is worse than the camel's nose in the tent. Not that there aren't good public servants, but there is a very big difference, as you know better than anybody. And I would again go back to the issue of self-regulation, which Joel has written a great deal about, we've been involved in somewhat, that it's a matter of the ethics of the institution and of the field that are much more important to get right, it seems to me, than to go at it legislatively or from a very heavy regulatory hand. This philanthropy, in my view, is an enormously fragile subsystem. A lot of things can do a lot of damage without much effort. And I know Joel says it in his book many times. I mean, the value and the values that this field has, it seems to me, are terribly important to preserve and preserve well. And if they're bad actors, let's root them out and do something about it. And the Getty obviously is a perfect case in point. Where philanthropy's behavior, by the way, was not very good. Not very good. But that's another story. So that's what I think about. Jonathan.
Oh, thank you. My focusing area is the volunteerism, and in the terms of philanthropy, and in comparative studies, they deal with philanthropy with the concept of volunteerism. For example, the Johns Hopkins University, they surveyed about the comparison study of countries, and then United States is also one of the most big countries with philanthropy, and then. But when it comes to the civic engagement you mentioned today, I think the civic engagement will be more efficient when combined with the volunteerism. And then there's one thing I want to talk about your opinion. Even though when I joined this program in this seminar, I sometimes feel confused about philanthropy is just the foundation role, is or not. And then I always thinking about the volunteerism and the civic activities, and I want to listen to your opinion. And another thing is,
well, let's take it one at a time.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to get spun out. So the question essentially was the relationship between philanthropy and civic engagement.
Yeah. The reason why I asked the question is, in the philanthropy of the Chronicle, recently I read the article. The 21 people of the American big donors gave over $100 million last year. And then in contrast to this phenomenon, and then their volunteer activities have their lowest point since 2002. Right. And then my question is, their volunteer activities and the donation by money, is it substitutory good or is it complementary goods? Yeah,
well, good question. They both have their place. You can't say let's do one and not the other. What is true is that volunteerism, in a long-term sense, not just episodic stuff, in America is down, and it's most critically down among young people. I just saw some government stats a couple of weeks ago where actually volunteerism among young people was increasing since 2001 until this last year when it took a real nosedive. I don't think one substitutes for the other. I think they can work in tandem. That so many people are willing to give $100 million or more is a reflection of the gross capacity of this country to generate wealth. Whether people will use it properly is another question. So I'm okay with both. And I don't think one pushes the other out. It's a both and, it's not an either or.
Could I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The question is about the Americans, the resources of the nonprofit sector. And then the question is, even though America is the representative of the philanthropy in the world, I think, and I believe, and then so over 2.1 of the GDP is donated by is to only one country over the world. Even though America is the representative of the philanthropy, and then when we group the countries in the resources of the nonprofit sector, America belong to the fee-dominant country. Yeah, the commercialism of the nonprofit sector. Yeah, some countries are, for example, Northern Europe countries. I don't know which is good or not, but some countries are government dominant in nonprofit sector resources, right, and some countries in their fee dominant. America is also for about 40% will be resourced by their fees from the commercialization of the nonprofit sector. Right. And then this one question of mine I'm interested in nowadays is the commercialism of the nonprofit sector. It's also dealt with in the Joel Fleischman's classes very deeply, and I want to listen to your opinion about the commercialism of the nonprofit sector.
Okay.
He's actually written about that subject.
It's a subject I know a bit about. The strength of the sector, I've come to conclude, is it's like an ecosystem. If you have a monoculture, one kind of tree in a forest, it's not healthy. So if you have just one stream of money, say government sources, and government being a vendor to government, if something happens with your contract or something on that scale, the institutions are in very, very great danger. So I believe that multiple sources of funding, in this case, foundations, community foundations, individuals, maybe membership, vending to governments or whatever, the more one can diversify their revenue base, the better off they will be. Now, it seems to me that this is the trend that's been going through nonprofits in America for 20 or so years. Greg has studied this very much too, so you might well have an answer as well. Straight commercialism is very small. It's very small. So when you lump together commercialism and selling services to the government, the big one here is the sale of services. The one of selling your own services or, tickets at a theater or something like that, those are not anywhere near as consequential as when you are linked in at the hip with governments. Now, that's a whole other subject, the question of what makes a nonprofit a nonprofit. Are nonprofit hospitals like Duke Medical Center, is that really a nonprofit competing with HCA in Louisville or something like that? That's another conversation. But let me just close what I'm saying by raising that. When you start to talk about commercialism and commercialization, and you begin to break it up by sector and subsector, the hospitals sector of America, or the healthcare sector of America, is about ready in the next 24 months to get slapped hard by legislators or attorneys general in various states. It's happening now in Minnesota. It's happening in a number of other states. And so the issue of what makes a nonprofit is coming up definitionally in legislation and regulation in a lot of places in the country.
I want to come back to you in a second minute. I wanted to ask Tom, who I think had an even longer tenure at the Family Foundation, the Donald Family Foundation, than you did.
Well, it had actually ended.
Chief executive. How long were you at the Donald Foundation as chief executive?
23.
23 years. So So,
Hats off.
so the question is this: not all family foundations are alike. The cultures vary very widely, and the behavior very widely. I was on the board of a family foundation in Chicago, which was like peaches and cream compared to what Ed described. And Tom, as I said, was the executive director of the Ezekiel Trails Foundation for 23 years. You want to say anything about about this?
Well, maybe the most important thing I can say is I could say what I will say if all of them were here. I had several days, like you described. I must say, in the case of the member that I had that experience with, and by the way, I would be happy to have sitting here as I stated, probably were not as bad as what you described, and did not last as long as you described. And I had some of the same experience you had. What made a difference was that there were other members of the board that clearly, if there were a dispute, I knew were on my side. And
Did you have outside board members?
That made a difference. I had, at times, even a majority of outside board members, so not, it's tended to be one more family than non-family. But it is important, I guess, to say that there are justice foundations that are very different. There are families that are very different, and there's philanthropy. The suspicion about people taking advantage of them was always there. Some of the concerns that you expressed today, and also I was aware of the fact that it is, the problems of the very poor are great, but the problems of the very rich are great also. They're just different problems. But if you go through life always being identified as the son of, the grandson of, the great-granddaughter of, or something like that, that's something that you have to deal with, and I think it helps be sensitive to that. But I must say, Joel and I, and more than one other person in this room, have been exposed to families really at their worst in philanthropy, even though they may be great people outside of the family working. But I certainly have had experience with one generally at their very best. And I've seen some insight into some of the Rockefeller philanthropy is done extremely well from the standpoint of how family operates.
If I'm correct, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund has about the same amount of money that you've got, at least almost as much money as you have.
Yep.
And it's done a reasonably good job of really focusing with the years.
I agree, and they're going to get a good chunk of money. Our Rockefeller Brothers has been a good model on that side. Mixed culture, if you will, and it's turned out very, very well.
Even they, at times, want you to be clear about the fact that they had absolutely nothing to do with being born with that name.
Oh, yes.
And some who have parents who have another name are very clear to let you know that my father's name was, or my mother's name was.
Right.
I had the same goal you did of bringing Tom into this conversation. You mentioned you had 6 determinants of foundation effectiveness. I'd love to hear you talk about those and then have Tom do the same thing in terms of what do you think makes for a great foundation? Family foundation or not?
I'll go quickly through these. One, I wrote this a couple of weeks ago. Money is necessary but insufficient. It's vastly overrated as an indicator of intellectual standing, of impact, of capability, and of credibility. That's my first one. I can say it. 2, what we call beyond the money strategies are at least as important as grants. The determinants include respectful ties with grantees, leveraging other foundations and government money, collaboration with other foundations, advocating for or against public policies, consonant with the mission of the foundation, and representing the mission through strategic communications, writing, speaking, and so on. So that's beyond the money. 3, foundations that have overt theories of social change and a consistent point of view and how to deal with grantees and colleagues and governments are able to measure their success and course correct. So if you have a serious theory of change, you can begin to test how serious you're doing and how well you're doing. Without one, due diligence is useless. 4, foundations that grant money with clarity and candor take the first step towards success. Clarity plus strategic, effective execution can substantially compensate for the small size of grants. That's all relevant. 5, extensive positive relationships, funder-grantee, funder-funder, funder-government, are the principal determinants of long-term impact. Networks spur and affect long-term relationships. And then 6, post hoc assessments and evaluations are frequently marginal. Measures of success have to be transparent. Regular staff and board assessments are also involved in measuring success. Those are my 6.
Well, I don't want to intrude in this. I think they're great. I wouldn't disagree with the one of them, especially think that they're coming to the realization of how much you can do beyond giving out money, that people tend to appreciate that. But it's one that's important, and I think sometimes foundation trustees have to come to that realization that the conferring of credibility on something is a power you ought to be careful about, but it's a tremendous power. And I'd say in good management of a foundation, especially a family foundation, being very clear from the very beginning that it is not your money. And you and I have both been exposed to staff people who have gotten confused over the years about whether or not it was their money. And in my case, at least, being clear that I never had a vote on a grant. I don't think I ever was guilty of saying I made a grant to, or I funded, or so I think being very clear about that. And the other is that if you want to express your own values and convictions, and I'm saying that from the staff leadership standpoint, things that are very important to you, it's amazing how much of that you can do as long as your trustees' fingerprints are on everything that you do.
Well said. Fully.
Charlie, hey, could you say another word about government? You listed about 4 or 5 on your list. How did you think about your interactions with government over this time?
Well, generally positively. My first working world was in government. I like it. So I come out of the 60s and we think that governments can do some good. So I'm not a government basher. In general, that's where the money is. We all know that we don't have a lot of it. We may have very important leverage points and very real opportunities to make the ship start to turn. But if you want to get taken out in a financial sense, the only ones that are going to take you out is the government. So it's crazy to cut your ties with them or ignore them in various ways. Governments, though, as we all know, can be as capricious as foundations. And we get a new mayor, a new governor, game's up again.
New school superintendent.
New school superintendent.
2-year average tenure.
Yes, just think of funders who care, including the Gates Foundation, who care so much about that, and then bang, a whole new cast of characters comes in. So, in general, I think government should be considered an ally. And I gave a talk in Connecticut about 4 or 5 years ago, and it might be important, to the funders of Connecticut. and there were about 200 of them in the room. Most of them were trustees. And I asked the trustees, how many of you go to dinner with, go to parties with, or otherwise spend some time with the public servants of your community, both elected and not? And maybe a half dozen hands went up. What I thought was really interesting about that observation, because it's only one data point, was that a lot of people in philanthropy don't think that they ought to be representing what they do in another sector. And therefore, as we do know, nationally in the federal government particularly, the folks on the right side of the philanthropy spectrum have done a remarkable job by getting to know the people that count and who know how to count. But centrist philanthropy historically and left-leaning, truly historically, don't usually connect with government, and I don't know why. So for me to meet a city councilman in New York City, I take that as part of the job. It's good. But a lot of my colleagues, certainly a lot of trustees, don't want to mix.
There's one major exception to that, and that's Ford. I mean, you think about Ford during the Bundy years, when there was a great deal of Mike Sturdoff was engaged with government in designing a lot of those programs that they ended up starting and which government ended up picking up. Involved government, and Crawford was there at the same time. And that was true, I think, also of the education division, and it was true. I was true of the international division as well.
That was Doc Howe in education.
Doc Howe, and it was Mike Sturdoff, and it was
Fred Franklin
and David Bell.
Yeah, they took them right out of federal government.
And they came out of government themselves. But that's a striking exception.
Exactly.
But Joel, isn't it true if you go all the way back, I turn to you now as a guru, if you go all the way back to Andrew Carnegie, that was somewhere his approach was.
Andrew Carnegie did exactly the same thing. I mean, and why did he do the same thing? He had experience in making his steel fortune. That the way to get contracts for your companies was to be very close with the people in Washington, because they were one of the greatest purchasers of steel for armaments, and so he had a lot of experience in that, which he translated into his philanthropy. Yes, sorry.
I'm fascinated. Thank you very much for your remarks. Particularly fascinating to me, the background of the Burroughs Wellcome Fund is corporate foundations, a totally different culture. So it's very interesting to hear about your culture. You said something early on that there was a need really to support institutions that support philanthropy, council and foundation, other groups like that. I find there's a bewildering array of different organizations that are springing up, selling services to foundations, and there's the council on foundations at a national level, and then there are regional groups, and then there are North Carolina, our state groups, and then there are groups for effective organizations and effective philanthropy. So independent sector, obviously, some of these are very, very important and useful groups. How is philanthropy going to try to sort through all these different groups? Because it's sometimes very hard to know. You want to be a good citizen,
yes,
but you can also dribble dollars across a lot of these different institutions. And how are we going to really, who's going to be the watchdog there? The Council of Philanthropy can't do it because they are seen as a competitor. How do we sort that all out? Yeah, Joe, maybe you can give the answer to that.
I think a good university center where they...
Has anybody tackled that issue? No. Because I haven't seen that really. I see the university groups as part of the competition. Right. They're in there selling their services too.
That's absolutely
well, that is true.
Yeah.
I would imagine, it's Willie Sutton, I go with him.
No, I agree.
So, the money is here. I think we have a proliferation of individuals who are trying to find a way to legitimately make a career or a living out of this stuff. I think it's part of the due diligence process. I guess I'd answer it from back to the front. I think if a foundation makes a commitment to supporting institutions of the sector, then it will develop listening skills and observation skills that will enable it to do the right kind of checking out. Maybe more tiresome, but it will. It's the philanthropy that makes no commitment, that tends to be besieged by all these people and has not been around long enough to get into the swim of things. So it all looks like people hounding them one way or another to do a special.
Well, also
I'm
requires
exaggerating.
staff, yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is that it is as valid to do that as it is a youth policy or health policy or anything else. And I think it's important for foundations to take some smallish percentage of what they have and say, this is to care for our garden. And it could be 1% of the corpus. I don't know what, it will be determined. But that sounds to me, or feels to me like a way to begin to build a community where people can then share who's good and who's not, who do I listen to, who don't I. But absent that initial conception and commitment, then I think we're at the mercy of anybody who comes to us. Tony.
I'd like to ask you a couple of personal questions.
Sure.
You must have had some idea of what you were getting into 18 years ago.
No.
So I want to know why you took the job. And the second part is, when the situation was driving you crazy over a multi-year period, why did you stay? Why did you not leave?
All right. First question, did I have any inkling? No, really didn't. I had 2 interviews. This was a foundation that was truly below the waterline. You couldn't get information. I could regale you with stories. I wanted to be working at a foundation so much after my other side of the track life. And I went hunting to find out who were the members of the board of the Surdna Foundation, and there was no real data collection as there is now, and I couldn't find out. And then I found a list, and no one I knew anyone. I couldn't believe it. I kept reaching out, and I was giving a talk in Louisville, Kentucky, and I met a guy who was in the audience who came over to me. No, it wasn't Greg. It was a guy from Minneapolis. And he said, could you be help to me? I was doing my other work on entrepreneurship stuff. And we got friendly, and I said, oh, you're Minneapolis. Do you know a guy named John Andrews? This is how the whole thing unfolded. And he looked at me, he says, his name was Sandy Bemis. He ran the Bemis Paper Company, major paper company. Yeah. And Sandy says to me, he says, do I know him? I work in the office next door. I said, wow. Would you give him a resume for me? He says, of course I will. We got to know each other in New York, and I did a little work for them. Of course I will. So in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the 49th floor of the IDS Tower, all the retired CEOs of all the major corporations go there. It's called the Elephant Burial Ground. And so is the ex-head of 3M, the ex-head of Cargill, and so on and so forth. And these guys talk about grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and golf. And they go in with their secretaries, and they do good work. And Sandy had just retired from Bemis, and John Andrews had just retired from his company, and they were next-door neighbors in the office. That's how it happened. And I could go, there are 3 or 4 more amazing coincidences, but I won't go there. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I knew in my soul that I wanted to be on the philanthropy side, having done the other thing for 9 years. I was ready to go. The second question was...
Why didn't you leave?
I actually tried to leave, and I couldn't get a comparable job for, in the time that I was trying. Don't forget, these are phenomenal jobs. But that's the second answer to your question. If we are graced by being able to work in an institution like this, that you don't have to make payroll every week, and that you actually can be chartered to do good. I mean, I never forgot what a lucky guy I was. So even though I would put feelers out,
everybody else will want to do it.
well, come on, I mean, get in the game. So on the other side of it, I mean, you know how you want to, if somebody came and dazzled me with something, I would have left. But absent that, I fought like a dog on this one, a mad dog, because I knew that there was no better place for a person with my instincts than that job. So why would I give it up? It was like, it's confident. But I stuck it out. Yeah. And they stuck with me, to their credit. To their credit.
You said that your foundation did not in any way want to get involved in public policy.
In politics.
And what didn't you, I'm very much an advocate of what foundations can do in affecting public policy. And we're not a big foundation like you are, but wasn't it frustrating to you to know the differences in policy you could have made, and that would have enhanced your grants that you were, that y'all were
Yes.
getting? Was that not a frustrating thing?
Well, I wasn't clear, and I apologize for this. We were and are very much engaged in public policy kind of on climate change issues, on redlining of poor neighborhoods in terms of mortgages. We were always in some of these battles by funding groups who were doing work in Washington or the state capitals or so on. So we didn't run away from public policy, but it's never been the hallmark of the foundation. We always ran away from active politics. I only had one grant. Sorry, it wasn't my grant. The staff only had one grant.
Buck stops here.
Buck stops. Rejected. In all the time I was at Surdna, and we were at the beginning of the founding of AmeriCorps. And we had an idea, which was a good idea, about funding AmeriCorps to set up, as it got started, an alumni association, so that the alumni could get together over, like the Peace Corps associations, so that 5 and 10 years out, these corpsmen who had given service and time, effective citizenry, whatever you call it, could come back. And it was, I thought, a very useful, good grant.
We supported it too.
Yeah. And but on that one, we were turned down.
But would you have called legislators together to make a presentation about some of the environmental stuff you were funding?
We would be part of a group more likely to do it, like a half dozen foundation folks, which we've done a lot. For us to say, go to DC to talk with some congressmen or senators, I never felt the board wanted to do that. It was very clear they didn't want to do that. Greg?
Yeah, first, I just want to thank you, Ed, for such a inspiring and powerfully personal story. My admiration for you has gone up even more as a result of hearing what you went through. But I want to come back to something that's more, maybe drier, more of a conceptual issue. A theme that you raised just briefly early in your talk was the concern that foundations sometimes have about grantees becoming too dependent on them. And it's an interesting issue because I would think, especially for you, given what you did before you went to Surdna, which is helping nonprofits develop alternative sources of income, and a lot of the rhetoric around that movement has been around becoming less dependent on philanthropy, that being an objective that's held out for many nonprofits. Do you think dependence is a real issue? Is there something here that's a real issue that may not be solved by 3 years and off for a year? That's kind of a silly rule for doing it. But is there a real issue? And if there is, what should foundations do about it?
I guess I'm trying to work my way through examples to see, am I on solid ground when I say something or not? I think for the most part, dependency doesn't occur on one foundation very often. There are occasions when somebody will drop a big chunk of bucks, and then you have to be really careful about this, how the relationship develops. I don't think there's that much, if you're talking about an organization with a $3 million budget, middle-sized nonprofit, middle to upper middle, and they get a $250,000 grant from someone, it's an important donor. But in general, I would argue it doesn't produce dependency. The issue that does worry me is, and should worry us all, is any kind of a downturn in the economy. When many funders at the same time will yank the money or part of the money that they give for reasons that are extraneous to the organization. And that's a kind of dependency on philanthropy itself that in downturn times can be very, as we know, can be very damaging. So that's sort of like the best answer I can give. I bet there are cases where dependency has occurred. You may know them, Joel, but I don't know too many.
Should foundations do anything to help nonprofits prepare for this broader, this issue, the vulnerability of being too dependent on philanthropy overall?
Well, I would argue that if I had another life and time, that the kind of work some of us know, Clara Miller at the Nonprofit Finance Fund and that, most nonprofits, not all obviously, but I'd say a very serious chunk of them are very badly run financially and have a very poor understanding of how to use money well. I'm speaking wider than just the raising of money. And I think one of the things philanthropy could do well is to support operations like hers, which are now really going national. And they've created, I think you know, they've created various kinds of data formats that will tell the Guthrie Theater or tell some other organization, when you fill this out, you will know, even though you think you're healthy, you're really very unhealthy. I think philanthropy can be very helpful in funding various intermediaries like that to help improve NGOs and how they do their business. We did a very large piece of work, just as background, with TechSoup, a group in Seattle, which has now distributed well over $1 billion of Microsoft and other groups' software for free to NGOs that are a very low price, to put modern technology and IT stuff into the body corpus of the nonprofit. I think another very helpful activity. That's what I think we can do. You may have other ideas, and I'd love to hear them. But we certainly should be as attentive to finance as we are to program. And the troubles arise when foundation program staff have generally low skill sets in understanding the financial sides of NGOs and how they run. It's one of the reasons why I did and would still, my staff to sit on the board of one or two of the grantees that we support. I want them to get that budget stuff right into their heads.
I'd add one thing to that, which is that and I'm sure that people here who have worked in foundations will recognize this, but that at Atlantic, we always worried about the exit strategy. And we were very, I would say, consistent with grantees that up front, before we make a grant, we have a discussion with them about, well, what happens when our grant ends. And we would try to establish criteria, benchmarks, which would suggest to them that when the circumstances which we might be willing to continue. We were a foundation that had no reluctance at all in continuing to support grantees for 15 or 20 years if we wanted to. And we never had an arbitrary rule about it. And the general assumption is, if we agree on outcomes, interim outcomes, benchmarks, and you continue to meet those benchmarks, and you've got good leadership doesn't change in the organization, we will be perfectly happy to go on supporting you and perhaps even increasing the grants. In other cases, we always developed a ratchet down when we made the original grant. It said, frequently if it was a 3-year or a 5-year grant, it would decline with each year so that there was kind of a preparation for it. The important thing is to think about it. It isn't really a question, and also to think about it cooperatively, collaboratively with the grantees, to get them to think about it, because That's one way of avoiding the kind of surprise that occurs when suddenly a foundation that's been supporting you just decides it's not going to do it anymore. And then, the foundation will say, well, you may be dependent on us, but too bad. We're not going to do anything about it. Anticipating it is really important. Keeping it there as an option with the grantee. I think we've run over it, and I think that, but if there's an urgent question from anyone, we can take it, but otherwise, did you have another question? Yeah, no. If otherwise, then let me just thank Ed for a very stimulating and interesting discussion. I remind you that our next presentation is a week from today. Rick Rapson, the president of the Kresge Foundation, the new president of the Kresge Foundation, who I think we circulated, did we circulate?
Tomorrow morning.
She's going to circulate
the title is hilarious.
Title, which is very funny. And
you're going to do what with your grandmother's china?
That's the title of his talk. So anyway, it'll be very. He's just been in the job for a year, so I think, and so it'll be quite interesting. As in contrast to Ed, who's been there for 18 years, 19 years, and so you're looking at it backwards. Now you're looking at it forwards next week. It'll be interesting. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.